Obviously the Russians would not have anchored two warships off the coast of Venezuela in range of U.S. naval forces unless they were trying to send a signal. I think the signal is pretty obvious. You have done everything in your power, that is Washington, to destroy us in Moscow. You advanced this border of NATO to the very limits of its capability, and you've caused the deaths of probably 130,000 or so Russians, administration, and liquidate the army. All we had to do is replace the people at the top and say, we would like to do business with you. We can't do business with Saddam Hussein, but we will do business with you. Intelligent agenda that says no war. We need to restore good relations with Russia. We need to get back to the business of being a scientific industrial power and raising our standard of living and getting out of this abyss that we've fallen into. Had he been elected to a second term, I think he would have been much more effective and done a great job. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But the rest of them haven't learned. They're not really interested. And I think that applies to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump would much rather go to a world wrestling event in Las Vegas than sit down with foreign leaders talking about anything.
Yeah, I think it's a very serious buildup that's designed to do more than simply intimidate. I think there is a willingness to intervene in Venezuela. Keep in mind that we've had plans for this sort of thing on the shelf for years. This is not exactly new by any stretch of the imagination. Venezuela was always a potential target, let's put it that way, given Hugo Chavez, who preceded Maduro, his ideology, and his connection potentially to China and Russia. So I think, unfortunately, we're on the road to some form of intervention, and I don't know what it is because, again, as I try to point out to people, the size of the country is so enormous that it's hard to imagine how 16,000 troops from the Army and 2,500 or 3,000 Marines are going to make much of a dent. There's a population of 30 million. Most of it lives in the coastal regions. So I just don't know. The question that keeps coming up is is the specific political military objective that we're striving to achieve? And the next question, once you establish whatever that is, and I'm not sure what it is, then the question is it attainable? Can we do it? War is, as everybody points out, that has any sort of common sense is so unpredictable in its character that one wonders just exactly what we want to do, and we can talk more about that. There are a lot of things floating around inside the Beltway that we can discuss, but the problem is that I haven't heard anything from the President of the United States about what it is that he wants us to do. In fact, is very reminiscent of LBJ's crusade to intervene in Vietnam. He never specifically said, what are we going to do while we're there? Well, we're going to support the legitimate government and fight communism. Well, I don't know. That's a slogan. That's not a military objective. And I think we did that for years and years and years without much result. So my question is, what specifically is our objective? Perhaps they've decided that to tell anybody would put it at risk, and they won't. I don't know. Well, if we follow the historic pattern, we have already infiltrated Venezuela with large numbers of operatives from the Central Intelligence Agency. We may well have assistance from others, including MI6. I don't know. Now, what will these CIA agents do in cooperation with potentially mercenary forces? Mercenary forces are easy to pick up. The problem with them is that they're not always very reliable. But if you're trying to start a war, they can certainly start something. So that's probably in the offing right now, if it's not already happening. And then the second thing is we now have 2 Russian destroyers anchored off the coast of Venezuela. And the question is, what does that mean? Obviously the Russians would not have anchored 2 warships off the coast of Venezuela in range of U.S. naval forces unless they were trying to send a signal. I think the signal is pretty obvious. You have done everything in your power, that is Washington, to destroy us in Moscow. You advanced this border of NATO to the very limits of its capability, and you caused the deaths of probably 130,000 or so Russians and nearly 1 8 million Ukrainians, and you refuse to drop this war. You keep feeding this fire, even though I was looking at some reports yesterday. The Russians are capturing Ukrainian boys or young men who have been in uniform for exactly 1 week. And as a result, they don't know what they're doing. They obviously have no appetite for meeting their maker at this point. So large numbers are surrendering. So the Russians are asking, what are you doing? Well, they've given up on trying to persuade us to back off and put an end to this. So now they've said, we're not going to let you get away with what you've done in Ukraine, in Venezuela, and this is the new quote unquote multipolar world. The post rules-based liberal order, which I always laugh at because I never saw any evidence for real rules other than whatever we wanted to impose. So the bottom line is, I think this could blow up in our faces. If we end up in a fight with those warships and we sink them, which I would imagine we could do, it's hard to tell what might happen at that point. I mean, the Russians have the capability to target everything from essentially Lithuania all the way to Romania and from Poland all the way to the border with France. And they could do that. And they could do an awful lot of damage in a very short period of time. So I think this is sort of the last straw for the Russians. And I think we're surprised because we've always believed, the wrong things. We've believed that there's no one that can stand against us, that we're the most powerful force on the planet, and that the Russians are weak, incapable, incompetent. It's all nonsense. But that's what we've been peddled. It's a very desperately dangerous situation in that sense. And of course, the impact on the rest of Latin America is going to be huge no matter what happens if the Russians are absolutely challenged in the waters off of Venezuela by us. The rest of Latin America will watch carefully. And if we push this and the Russians respond, that could cause large numbers of states in Latin America to align quickly with Russia against us seeing Russia as well. At least someone is willing to stand up to the evil Yankee because they don't particularly care much for us anyway. And if you want to go back over the historical record, you can find lots of examples of disastrous interventions. I wish there was some good news, but I don't see any. I see stupidity and self-delusion on stilts. But the objectives, which are, some of the goals at least, which appears to be in the pipeline, is obviously and that no one can enter the Western Hemisphere under any circumstances from outside the hemisphere without our express permission. And they cite this Monroe Doctrine. But the Monroe Doctrine really didn't play very significantly in the 19th century. Contrary to what many people believe, we couldn't enforce it. In fact, you could make a good argument that the Royal Navy, at least until the Civil War, did a great job of enforcing the Monroe Doctrine because the Royal Navy didn't want other European powers intervening on the North American continent. No, I think the bottom line is this. We have decided, for whatever reason, and I've heard people say several things. First of all, remember Venezuela's role in helping to defeat Donald Trump in the 2020 election. This has to do with the Dominion software issue. Okay, that's fine. I don't think that justifies military intervention, but nevertheless, that comes up. The next point is the one on resources. And there are people in Washington who sat down and tried to, quote unquote, collateralize what's in Venezuela on the assumption that it could be used to boost our economy and essentially save us from default and economic crisis and financial collapse. The problem with collateralizing someone else's resources is that you have to go into the country. You have to assert absolute control over it. And we don't have the forces, certainly we don't have the ground forces to do such a thing. And I don't think it would be widely regarded as legitimate in the eyes of the world. It almost speaks or is reminiscent of, the arrival of Hernan Cortez in Mexico. His goal was very obvious. Find as much gold as possible, pull it out, and ship it back to Spain. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like this is Operation Cortez. I don't think it'll work that way. I don't think it's necessary. But again, there are people that are upset with the fact, as you point out, that Russia and China have investments there. They both do. The Russians and the Chinese have companies operating in Venezuela. So as a result, when Maduro made his offer to Trump, which everyone I've spoken to they can't tell me the details, but they say it was very, very generous and lucrative, he was refused because I think Donald Trump has been persuaded by people that everyone else in the region needs to be booted out. Well, again, contrary to Monroe Doctrine nonsense, we've had the French, the British, the Russians, the Spaniards in the Western Hemisphere off and on for a very long time, and we managed to cope with it and we survived it. So I don't think that's a good excuse, and I don't see how we collateralize all those riches, terms of gold and emeralds and lithium, obviously, which everybody wants access to rare earths plus oil and gas, even though the oil is heavy and high in sulfur content and problematic when it comes to refining. It takes longer, but you can still pull out 2 barrels of oil in Venezuela for the price of 1 barrel of oil in West Texas. That's true. And probably 3 or maybe even more out of Iran and Libya for 1 barrel out of West Texas. But do we need to do this? Do we declare war, march in wherever we like without regard to people's needs? And when you start lobbing missiles, launching all these airstrikes and missile strikes, you're going to kill a lot of people. I'm always amazed at the people that say, well, this is a precision strike operation. Yeah, well, it may be precise in a lot of ways, but unfortunately, no matter how precise you are, you're going to kill people. When you begin to kill people and the blood flows, the blood is bad blood. You begin to stimulate anger, you permanently offend people. It takes a long time to recover from that, but I don't see any evidence that anybody's really thinking this through. My impression is that there is no strategy. There isn't. I mean, other than let's push NATO out as far as we can and hopefully we can rape and destroy Russia. I mean, that was mentioned in many times in my presence by the same kinds of people that are currently killing people in Palestine. They are working overtime right now to go into Venezuela. So in that sense, it's linked, but it's not an American grand strategy as far as I can tell. So I don't understand. I haven't seen any tangible, concrete evidence for systematic planning and preparation for the possibility that you destroy a government and that you create anarchy and you are then compelled to intervene and try to restore some measure of order. That's a serious mistake. We were much better off in Iraq in 2003. We did not have to occupy that country. The army was intact because most of the army did not fight. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. You still had an administration in Iraq, so we didn't have to dismantle the administration and liquidate the army. All we had to do is replace the people at the top and say, we would like to do business with you. We can't do business with Saddam Hussein, but we will do business with you. And as soon as there's order on the streets and we have reached some sort of agreement as to how to proceed, then we will withdraw. Well, that's doable in a place like Iraq, and we blew it, made terrible mistakes. Is that doable in Venezuela? I'm not sure. Venezuela is infinitely larger, the size of what? Germany, France, Austria, Switzerland, together with 30 million people. A little more challenging. So I just don't have any good answers. But I don't see anything good happening as a result of what we're planning to do. Let's put it that way. Well, I sent you something this morning. I don't know if you saw it or not. Young Ukrainian, you might even want to consider running that, because I think that's very dramatic, and I think it points to something that's very, very wrong in Ukraine. Yeah, I think this is one of the flaws of Trump's strategy, though, because it seems as if his assumption is that the relative decline of the U.S. in terms of the rise of other powers, that this is caused merely by the weakness of various leaders. And if you just show enough strength, then the pieces will fall into place. But the Russians and the Chinese, being two great powers, it's interesting that they neither see the possibility of, well, essentially falling in line, but also they don't have to because of capabilities. But once that maximum pressure doesn't work, it's hard to say what is plan B. But it does appear that much of their resentment in Moscow, though, is more directed towards Europe these days. When they speak about the need for a greater deterrent and also possibly targeting if a conflict would break out, they tend to reference the Europeans' war rhetoric. Well, the Russians have no interest in a war with Europe. That's the last thing on their agenda. They want peace with Europe. They want to do business with Europe. So if we take France and Britain, for instance, Mr. Macron has decided that he's going to send the French Foreign Legion, some 2,000 men, to Ukraine. My assumption is they'll go into Odessa. The French already have a modest presence there, but that's about as much as he can do. And the French military leadership has made it very clear that they are in no position to send anything else. I think they'll present enormous resistance to the idea. I think you have a similar situation right now in London. Stormer is in a great deal of trouble because he was making promises involving the dispatch of 30,000 British troops to fight in Ukraine without consulting anyone, without telling anyone. I think the king has now finally wakened up and intervened and will put a stop to this. I would expect Starmer to go away, and I doubt very seriously that the king or the Prince of Wales are anxious to go to war with Russia. I don't think they see any reason to do that at all. And they've already made it very clear the problems that they face that are most severe are those inside their country involving this mass migration of people that they can't afford, they don't need, and they really don't want. So I think if you're President Putin, one of the things that he has counseled privately, I'm quite certain of this, is patience regarding Europe. If the Russians are willing to exercise some patience, the European governments will change, they will fall, and new people will come to power. I think that's going to happen in Britain and France. And when that happens in those two countries, it's going to be very difficult for Bance and the lunatics that support him in Germany to stay in power. And the AfD, the Futland, is growing every day because they have an intelligent agenda that says no war. You know, we need to restore good relations with Russia. We need to get back to the business of being a scientific industrial power and raising our standard of living and getting out of this abyss that we've fallen into. So I really think that the Russians, at least as far as Europe is concerned, have taken a good position. Now, there are some wild cards in this. One of those is Poland. This new president, Nowotrosky. I think he makes a lot of sense in some areas, but he's been unwilling to step forward and fundamentally part ways with his predecessors. He needs to get rid of them, and this man Tusk needs to go away. They've got to get rid of these globalists that want to drag Poland into a war that Poland doesn't need and doesn't want. So I don't know what will happen in Poland. I think we have to watch that very, very carefully, at least as carefully as we watch what happens in Berlin. But I have a certain amount of confidence that the Germans will climb out of this pit of despair that they're in, and they will throw Mats out. Now, beyond that, I think they'll find a way to end this conflict with Russia because it just makes no sense. You got Slovakia and Hungary, and to a lesser extent, Serbia. Even though Serbia has been playing both sides of the fence, unfortunately, nevertheless, their population is very pro-Russian. And I think the Hungarians and the Slovaks are not necessarily pro-Russian. They're pro-peace. Well, I think that's President Trump's private wish. He certainly has already instructed us to withdraw all but a skeleton crew, for all intents and purposes, from Bulgaria and Romania. I think he would like to get out of other places as well. But remember, he is surrounded by people that are preaching the opposite. They're telling him, double down on South Korea, challenge North Korea, double down on Taiwan, challenge China, double down on the Philippines and the South China Sea, where we've already positioned missiles aimed at China. I mean, this is just blatant stupidity. There's no requirement for any of it. It's self-defeating. But he's listened to that because while he wants to disengage to the extent that he can from Europe, and I would argue he'd probably like to disengage for the Korean Peninsula and potentially Japan, he lacks the self-confidence that springs from understanding and knowledge. What do I mean by that? I may have said this before. If I have, I apologize. You can stop me halfway through this. In the 50 seconds, Eisenhower mused in some of his works, especially after he left office in the 60 seconds, about what does a president need to know. And he needs to understand the international system. He needs to understand the economy. Not just the domestic economy, but the global economic system. He needs to understand the military how it works or how it does not work, and what it can and cannot do. And then finally, he needs to know how to get himself elected. Now, everybody who comes to that office has figured out how to get elected. That's how they arrived. That's fine. The problem is that very few people arrive. In fact, I would argue the last person that arrived with anything more was probably Richard Nixon. And prior to Richard Nixon, it was Eisenhower. Now, JFK, John F. Kennedy, learned a great deal while he was on the job. And I think had he been elected to a second term, I think he would have been much more effective and done a great job. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But the rest of them haven't learned. They're not really interested. And I think that applies to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump would much rather go to a world wrestling event in Las Vegas than sit down with foreign leaders talking about anything. That's where he's comfortable. He loves interacting with his supporters. That's why he likes to hold these rallies and speak to them. He sees that as leadership, and he equates a lot of that with governing. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And so we're expecting him to essentially embrace greatness. Now, what do I mean by that? Greatness means you recognize the limits of your power. You recognize the limits of your interests. It's back to Palmerston, who said the British Empire has, only permanent interests and no aspirations beyond that. No permanent allies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests. I don't think that works with him. He personalizes everything. Oh, I get along well with him. He's a friend of mine. All that is rubbish in international relations. Everything turns on interests. I doubt seriously that President Trump has ever sat down and said to anybody, tell me what our interests are in country X. Then tell me who else has interests in country X. I don't see that happening. And if you don't sit down and recognize who has the interest and who does not, you cannot also come to terms with the reality of your limitations. And again, historically, we are a naval power and an aerospace power. We are not really a land power. We have only occasionally raised large armies to fight.